Good morning. I'm Reverend Matthew E. Long, Peace Unity Network, peaceunity.net, and we're studying the attitudes of being based upon the Sermon on the Mount. It's a thematic approach to Jesus' teachings in the Gospel according to Matthew, chapters 5, 6, and 7, which have become known as the Sermon on the Mount, as he walked up, as it says that he went to the top of the mountain. To deliver this sermon, and whether this sermon was an extemporaneous speaking, and Matthew, the disciple Matthew, was taking notes, or perhaps Jesus and Matthew sat down together, and Jesus dictated, and Matthew took notes, and they worked up this sermon before he prepared it, or it's a compilation of writings. We don't know for sure, but what we do know is that these are extremely important principles for life and for living, like the Ten Commandments provided a framework for life and for living in Old Testament times, and the Sermon on the Mount, the Beattitudes especially, provide a framework for understanding the New Testament and the teaching of Jesus. Now we're working with the fifth Beatitude today. We've already covered the first four, plus we spent a couple of weeks on the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, which is in chapter 6 and goes along with the fourth Beatitude. So what we found is that the Beatitudes are like a framework or a table of conduct, text or index for the rest of the sermon. The first four Beatitudes we've talked about. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And the poor in spirit is about spiritual pride, being humble, realizing that we're all God's children, and there are no chosen special people. There are no chosen special religions. That we all are seeking the same God, all seeking the same truth in different ways, taking different paths. The second Beatitude, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And remember, he was speaking to the Jewish people, people who thought they were the chosen people. He was talking often to Pharisees and scribes and Sadducees and the religious authorities of the day. And just like in the parable of the Good Samaritan, he's saying that just because you're a priest or a Levite doesn't mean you do the right thing. That somebody who as lowly as a Samaritan, who was considered to be a lesser than kind of person, was the one that did the right thing. And so he's being a revolutionary once again, saying that you are not the chosen people, that we are all the chosen people. And that creates a certain sense of loss in us when we start realizing that we are not the end all, that we are not the center of the universe, and we start realizing that we are part of the whole, that we are, as I like to say, points of awareness in the mind of God, that God is that infinite creative and intelligence, and we have consciousness and can be conscious of that presence and that power when we choose to, when we turn to it in prayer and meditation. And that mourning that comes with the loss, it's a release, it's a freedom, it's being free. So the idea of being poor in spirit is about being open to what is real. And the mourning is about being free from those limitations, those self-imposed limitations. The third Beatitude, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And being meek is not about being a Casper milk toast and people walking all over you, but to touch life lightly. And this actually has to do with our relationship with God and with our good. To be meek is to be receptive, being receptive, non-resistant, or receptive to our good. Non-resistance is not resisting our good. We put up a block to our good quite often. I always often say that that giving and receiving, we'll talk about that in a later episode, the giving and receiving are one. You cannot give without receiving. You cannot receive without giving. Because if somebody were to offer you something and you don't receive it, you are denying them the opportunity to give. And by receiving, you are giving them the opportunity to give and to share. So it's a giving and receiving are one. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That has to do with our relationship to God, to being receptive to our good. And when we are receptive to our good, all that we need and desire is readily provided. One of my favorite affirmations that I use quite often with prayer requests, is recognizing that God is our source. And with God as our source, all that we need and desire is readily provided. All that we need and desire is readily provided. So that's the attitude of being receptive. Now we talked about the hungering and thirsting for righteousness, right? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And hungering and thirsting is Eric Butterworth in his book talks about the teacher who puts the student's head under the water until he can't breathe and he thinks he's going to die, and he pulls his head up and says, "What did you want more than anything?" He said, "I wanted air." And he said, "Would you want God as much as you wanted air, you will know God." And when we are hungering and thirsting for righteousness, it consumes us. And it's the right use of our consciousness. It has absolutely nothing to do with being right or wrong. And those people who think they are righteous and they can tell us what we can do and can't do are not practicing the principles of Christianity. Anybody who declares that one thing is right and that you have to follow a certain way, of course that's law, the nature of laws and everything else. But hungering and thirsting for righteousness is about the right use of our consciousness. And when we are using our consciousness to be beneficial, to be helpful, right? It's a positive consciousness. Being positive is the attitude of being. Being positive, affirmation, building up a positive growth consciousness. So it's affirming our good. It's affirming that God is our source. It is knowing the truth of our being open, free, receptive, positive. And then I spent a couple of weeks talking about the Sermon on the Mount, not the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, which art in heaven, etc., etc., and looking at it as a model of positive prayer. It often comes across as being a beseeching prayer, but really, if we were just to modify the wording just within parameters of the language, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed is thy name. Thy kingdom has come, thy will is done in earth as it is in heaven. You give us this day our daily bread, and you forgive us our trespasses as we have forgiven our trespassers. And you do not lead us, or don't leave us in temptation, but deliver us from evil. So if we make it just a slight changing of the be to is, etc., we make it a statement, a positive statement of affirmation, a model of positive prayer. And Jesus didn't say, pray this prayer. He said, pray like this. So he was giving us a model for positive prayer. So today we're moving on to the fifth beatitude, attitude of being. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. They shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the merciful, so they shall obtain mercy. Now this is an interesting one. It's the only one where the quality given is the quality received. We are giving mercy. We are being merciful, which means we are not condemning. We are not accusing. We are not destroying. Right? We're being merciful. We are showing a higher way. We're moving to a higher way. For they shall obtain mercy, and we shall obtain that higher way. Again, it's the law of consciousness. It's being conscious. This is our attitude of being today. Being conscious is a statement of the law of mind in action, or the law of mind action. The law of consciousness, that as we give, so shall we receive. The thoughts held in mind produce after their kind. That giving and receiving are one. As we do to our brothers, we would have do unto us, right? Do unto your brother as you would have them do unto you. These are positive statements of being conscious, the law of consciousness, that as we give, so shall we receive. We've been working primarily with this book, Discover the Power, that's the other book, Sermon on the Mount by Emmett Fox. And he talks about this particular beatitude, and he calls it the law of life. I call it the law of consciousness, which is Eric Butterworth, longtime unity minister, uses that term. He calls this a brief summary of the law of life, which he develops more fully later in the sermon. And he talks about it in different passages. It's the law of life, so it's part of all of these attitudes, really. The point the scientific Christian needs to note is that, as usual, the vital bearing of the principle covered in this beatitude lies in its application to the realm of thought. As within, so without. Those are the words Eric Butterworth uses that, and I think Emmett Fox says similar sorts of things here, and we'll get to that in a little bit. There's the law of life in the realm of thought. Eric Butterworth, in his book Discover the Power Within You, talks about this particular passage on page 65, where he says this attitude reveals the law of consciousness, that life is lived from within out. If you want to be loved, you must love. If you want friends, you must be friendly. If you want just treatment, be just. You may not always be able to change the world about you, but you can change your thoughts about the world, and when you do this, you change your world, which is the world of your thought. The only thing we have to work with is what we think, say, and do. That's the only thing that we have any control over. I can't control people, places, and things. I can't make people do what I want them to do. I may have employees who I pay to do certain things a certain way, but they're not always going to do the way I want it to do, and sometimes you just have to accept that it's not going to be 100% the way that I want it. But we have to change our thoughts. When you do this, you change your world. If I change myself, if I change how I think, what I say, and what I do, if I have that in alignment with Spirit, with good orderly direction, that's my definition of God or understanding of God, good orderly direction, divine mind, infinite creative intelligence, absolute infinite creative presence and power in our lives, which is just some of the ways that we can talk about this undefinable reality. That once I align myself, what I think, say, and do, with that good orderly direction, then all things work together for good. All things work together. We have changed the world when we change ourselves. But nothing changes until we change ourselves. On the next page, he talks about Jesus is emphasizing that what comes to you is what your consciousness has drawn to you. What you emphasize is what you draw to you in consciousness. You can change the pattern of attraction and change your world. This is why Jesus says later, love your enemies and pray for those who despitefully use you, which we're going to get to in a minute, because that's the rest of the Sermon on the Mount that relates to this particular beatitude. It says, love your enemies, not because they deserve it, because you must take a step up in consciousness to evoke the higher working of the law. We have the law, right? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and that's the part of the Sermon on the Mount that he talks about. But I bring to you anew, love your enemies. We must take it to a new dimension. Be merciful no matter what we are received. That's the whole idea of forgiveness. If you look at that word, to give forgiveness, to give for. In other words, we give love for whatever has been received. If we want to receive love, what do? We give love. If we've received something else, we have to look at it as A Course in Miracles would say, there's only two messages. I love you or I want your love. And that second message can get pretty polluted sometimes. But when we realize, if we think about it for a moment and say, okay, did I hear I love you? No. So that one I need to remember is that means I'm hearing I want your love. It doesn't matter what the words are being used, that's the meaning behind it. I want your love. I want your caring. I want your nurturing. I want your fellowship. I want your companionship. I want this some sort of connection. I want your love. You were either saying, I love you, or I want your love. And when we realize that, then we can decide the kind of world we want to experience. And this one more paragraph here on page 66. He says, decide the kind of world you want to experience, the kind of friends you want to have, the success you want to achieve, the kind of condition you would like to see manifest in your home, your neighborhood, your office, and begin to think of the kind of thoughts will draw them to you by the irresistible force of consciousness. The irresistible force of consciousness. In his book, Prayers of the Cosmos, Neil Douglas Klotz looks at the Aramaic words that are being used in this particular passage, which is interpreted as, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And one of the things he notices those words, that merciful and mercy, in the Aramaic, the ancient root of those words is womb, or an inner motion extending from the center or depths of the body and radiating heat and ardor. So the womb is a creative space, right? It's where the fetus grows and unfolds before it is birth, comes down the birth channel and becomes a living being and expresses in this three-dimensional realm. And so what that being merciful is creating, that is that law of consciousness, the law of mind action, the law of life. Continuing on with this discussion of the Beatitude, moving to the section within the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, which talks about this particular attitude of being. We go to the chapter 5, verses 38 through 48, which starts, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist one who is evil, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to him who begs from you, and do not refuse him who would borrow from you. Emmett Fox, in his book Sermon on the Mount, says, first off on this, he says, Jesus is the most revolutionary of all teachers. I think I used that a little bit ago. He turns the world upside down for those who accept his teaching. When once you've accepted the Jesus Christ message, nothing is ever the same again. He said, goes on to say, Jesus went down to the root of things and attacked that. Right? Jesus was a revolutionary teacher. He was looking at it from a higher level of consciousness. He takes us to a new level, a level of cause, which is in mind. He talks about, he gives a quote from the Buddha, the Light of Asia, hatred ceases not with hatred. He's enunciating the great cosmic truth. This doctrine of resist not evil is the great metaphysical secret. To the world, those who do not understand, it sounds like moral suicide, the feeblest surrender to aggression. But in the light of the Jesus Christ revelation, it is seen to be superb spiritual strategy. Antagonize any situation, you give it power against yourself, offer mental non-resistance, and it crumbles away in front of you. This is the middle path of Buddhism. This is the wave theory of judo. It's the give and take of aikido. It's understanding that everything flows, and as we learn to flow with it, then we realize the blessings of it versus allowing it to roll over us and cause us pain and suffering. We're being conscious. Remember, this is about being conscious of life, being awake to what is going on. He goes on to talk about if when someone is behaving badly, instead of thinking of the trouble, you will immediately switch your attention off from the human to the divine and concentrate upon God or upon the real spiritual self of the person in question, you will find, if you really do this, that his contact will immediately change. This is the secret of handling difficult people. This is the golden key. He wrote a whole pamphlet about that. And basically, whatever the problem is, if we take our minds off the problem and put it on God, God is the solution. Dana Gatlin wrote a great book called God is the Answer. God is the answer. God is the answer. It's just different ways to say it. The title is God is the Answer. God is the answer. So when we take our minds off the problem and put it on the solution, which is God, then the solution comes forward into our lives. It's being conscious to how we are facing into our lives and what is going on for us, to resist not evil and to love our enemies. That's the next part of this. You have heard this said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I said you love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you or wrongfully use you, so that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. Right? So to be examples of God, we live from a consciousness of love. What's the one commandment? Love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your body. And the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these two lie all the commandments. If you look at the 10 commandments, the first 4 talk about our relationship to God. The next 6 talk about our relationship to our neighbors. So Jesus is saying, okay, look at those commandments and take them in a new way and realize it's just about love, loving God and loving our neighbors. Love. God is love. John 1:4-16. And those who abide in love, the letter of John 1:4-16, those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. So it's the great law of love, the great law of life, the law of mind action, the law of consciousness. It's about being conscious, the golden key. Now, Eric Butterworth, again, talking about these particular passages, page 97, says, Jesus is saying, in effect, so you want to get even? That is a perfectly normal desire. However, you must know that there is only one way to get even with another who has wronged you. Love him and bless him and forgive him. You may hold a person in enmity for the rest of your days, reminding yourself continually of what he did to you, but every time you display this enmity, you're holding up your manacles and saying, see, I am making him pay the price, but you have become a slave in the process. The only way you can get even is to take off the manacles, get rid of your enmity, and you can go free. It's a bitter pill to swallow. My friend Swami Beyondananda says, don't get even, get odd. Don't get even, get odd. Lift us up to a higher realm. Lift the whole relationship, lift the whole situation, the circumstance to a higher realm, to see God's mighty power, that good orderly direction, that ultimate reality working through us at a higher level, through a higher dimension of reality. We're stuck in this mentally and emotionally often in this three-dimensional reality, thinking that up is down, up and when reality is so much. There's so many higher dimensions to reality of thinking and feeling and a spiritual consciousness. There's at least 7 different realms, and that's a whole different topic for another lesson. Page 101 says, life is consciousness. Emmett Fox wrote a whole pamphlet called Life is Consciousness. The problems we face indicate that our wires are down. We need to repair the break within ourselves. Goes on to say, it is not the conduct of others, but our reaction to it that makes or mars our life experience. There's a great saying in 12-step circles about practicing resentment, holding. Emmett Fox talked a little bit about that, holding a grudge. It's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Because resentment, hate, anger, they only hurt the person who is resentful, hateful, angry. And so we must overcome that. Love is a divine energy that begins in God and has no end. Just such incredible stuff in these books. Incredible stuff. Now, we've also been talking about the 8 limbs of Raja Yoga, and the eightfold Buddha's path. That these are that they correlate very nicely with these 8 statements, especially the 8 limbs of yoga. The eightfold path are a little more general. The eightfold path topic today is right livelihood, and in Nina Gorkin's book, The Buddha's Path, said that there are 3 path factors, which are factors of good moral conduct: right speech, right action, and right livelihood. They have the function of abstaining from wrong speech, wrong action, and wrong livelihood. Wrong livelihood is wrong speech and wrong action committed for the sake of one's livelihood. So it's about living rightly. It's about being aligned with spirit, that we have a direct connection with God through our minds, and we bring that into our minds through our thoughts and our feelings and into our actions. So what we think, say, and do are in alignment. That's the right livelihood. That's the right speech. That's the right conduct. The right action is to be in alignment with the spirit. In the eight limbs of Raja Yoga, the 5th one is Pratyahara. Now, we talked about the first one is Yama, which means basically abstention from doing the things you shouldn't be doing, and then Niyama, which is doing the things you ought to be doing, and then we have the Asana, which the one perfect position, posture of maintaining a straight spine, allowing that energy to flow freely, and then we have pranayama, prana being breath or spirit, allowing that spirit to flow through our breath. And when I teach yoga and work with people, I remind them that our concentrating on our breath, keeping our minds focused on our breathing, is as important as how long or how deep that you hold a specific posture. That the postures, that the exercises that we normally think of as yoga are basically to get our minds out of the way, get our bodies and our minds relaxed enough that we can experience yoga, the true union of mind, body, and spirit. That's what yoga means, union. It's a union of mind, body, and spirit. So we're getting our bodies and our minds out of the way. And the 5th one is pratyahara, which means beyond sense. This is when the mind is withdrawn from sense objects, the sense organs also withdraw themselves from their respective objects and thus are said to imitate the mind. This is known as pratyahara. Those are the words of Patanjali, pronounced a couple of different ways. He goes, and then Swami Prabhavananda goes on in this book, How to Know God, and talks about how just as the provinces of a country are controlled by first taking over the central government, we must begin by controlling the mind before we can control the rest of the body. And that this is, and in order to control the mind, we must get to know it. Spend some time every day simply watching our minds. That's self-reflection, self-investigation, self-observation. This is one of the primary techniques to raise consciousness. We have to be aware of where we are now. And so spending that time in prayerful reflection, beyond sense, watching our minds, he calls it simple self-inspection, self-observation. And that's our work. And becoming conscious and being consciousness. That these are attitudes not only of being, but also of becoming what we are. Now we have a very obvious process in this being open and receptive, which leads to a sense of freedom and release, which really leads to being an empty vessel that is free to be receptive to our good, and then we fulfill that level of consciousness by being positive, affirming our good, and then we continue that process by becoming conscious, and we lift it up to a new level here. Now we're lifting it up to another level of being conscious of what the mind is doing, and the law of consciousness, the law of life, the law of mind action. That we are not only being, but we are also becoming, in the process of becoming what we are. Becoming what we are. God is my source. All I need and desire is readily provided. God is, I am. We are one. And so it is. And God bless.